At 6:47 p.m. on December 20th, 1988, the air inside the Days Inn in Savannah, Georgia carried a quiet tension. One of those moments where history shifts in ways no one can anticipate. Army Warrant Officer James W. Hall III, just 30 years old, walked into room 226 with the casual confidence of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times before. In his hands, a manila envelope. In his pocket, 7 years of top-tier access to the most sensitive signals intelligence the United States possessed. And in his mind, the assurance that tonight was merely another transaction in a long, profitable chain of betrayals. Waiting inside was the man Hall believed to be his new KGB handler. The operation had all the hallmarks of Soviet tradecraft: secrecy, abrupt transitions, compartmented roles. Hall entered without hesitation. He had documents, and he wanted money. $30,000 in cash lay on the table in exchange for the kind of secrets that could tilt a battlefield, blind an army, or unravel entire NATO intelligence frameworks. But neither Hall nor the Soviets knew that a deeper game was underway. The handler was not KGB. He was FBI Special Agent Dmitry Dujinsky, a Russian-American fluent in the language, trained for this exact deception, and now executing one of the most significant counterintelligence stings of the late Cold War. For 43 minutes, Dujinsky pressed Hall with questions. Hall answered all of them, eagerly, almost proudly. He described 6 years of espionage as if recounting an impressive resume. He spoke of dead drops in Germany, of shopping bags stuffed with classified documents smuggled out of the NSA Field Station Berlin, of photocopy sessions in Frankfurt, safe houses where East German operatives reproduced the originals before placing them back undetected. He explained methodologies, access levels, and technical systems with the clarity of a man convinced he would never be caught. It was a confession in real time, calm, detailed, complete. When Hall walked out with the cash, he carried not only thousands of dollars, but the certainty that he had successfully completed yet another transaction. He had no idea that less than 24 hours later, the FBI would be at his door, ending one of the most damaging espionage operations in modern American history. Between 1983 and 1988, James Hall sold the United States' most closely guarded signals intelligence capabilities to both East Germany and the Soviet Union. His total compensation, roughly $300,000. What he provided in exchange, however, was worth billions, economically, strategically, geopolitically. His betrayals struck directly at the technological heart of America's intelligence superiority during the Cold War. Among his greatest treacheries was Project Trojan, a classified global electronic warfare system capable of identifying and tracking Soviet armored vehicles, aircraft, and missile platforms through their signal emissions. This system was a jewel in America's SIGINT crown, a real-time sensor network that shaped NATO readiness and served as a deterrent in a Europe divided between nuclear-armed alliances. When Hall compromised Project Trojan, he effectively handed the Soviets a user manual to American battlefield intelligence. He also provided the Soviets with the National SIGINT Requirements List, a monumental 458-page document outlining every intelligence priority, global target, and technical capability of U.S. signals collection. For Moscow, this wasn't just a leak, it was a revelation. It allowed the KGB and the GRU to understand not only what the United States was listening to, but why, how, and with what strategic intent. In Cold War geopolitics, such knowledge could reshape entire military doctrines. But the damage didn't stop at documents. Hall compromised U.S. military liaison mission operations in East Germany, a sensitive reconnaissance activity governed under delicate legal agreements between the superpowers. On New Year's Eve 1984, he revealed the photographic techniques used to document Warsaw Pact armor and installations. 3 months later, on March 24, 1985, Major Arthur D. Nicholson Jr., an unarmed USML officer, was shot and killed by Soviet forces. The official Soviet narrative claimed Nicholson entered a restricted area. American intelligence officials, however, would later conclude the Soviets operated with foreknowledge of U.S. methods, knowledge Hall had sold. What made Hall particularly dangerous was not ideological conviction, foreign allegiance, or coercion. Unlike many Cold War spies, Ames, Hansen, Howard, Hall was motivated purely by greed. He wasn't driven by resentment toward his government, nor by admiration for the Soviet system. He simply wanted money, wanted luxury, wanted a lifestyle far beyond what an Army warrant officer could reasonably afford. And he got it. A new Volvo paid in cash, a new truck, a home purchased with a suspiciously large down payment, flying lessons, vacations, and a polished veneer of financial stability. He told colleagues he inherited money. Others heard stories about investments, real estate, lucky stock picks, even casino winnings. None of it true. But in a pre-9/11 intelligence environment, where financial audits were lax and insider threat monitoring was rudimentary, such stories passed unchallenged. Inside NSA Field Station Berlin, then one of the most critical SIGINT sites in the world, Hall operated freely. Perched atop the Teufelsberg, the artificial hill in West Berlin built from the rubble of World War II, the station was the nerve center of American electronic surveillance on the Warsaw Pact. It intercepted Soviet troop communications, monitored radar frequencies, collected ELINT signatures, and fed NATO planners with the intelligence needed to maintain strategic stability in Europe. The analysts who worked there were highly trained, meticulously vetted, and granted access to some of the most sensitive programs in the U.S. intelligence community, and one of them was betraying everything. By 1983, analysts began noticing something deeply troubling. Soviet forces were adapting to American electronic warfare at unprecedented speed. Countermeasures appeared that should have taken years to develop. NATO communication protocols, once considered secure, were suddenly obsolete. The Soviets had begun anticipating U.S. SIGINT methods in ways considered impossible unless someone with compartmented access was feeding them inside information. But the problem with SIGINT programs this vast is the sheer number of people who touch the data. Hundreds of analysts, officers, contractors, and technicians had top-secret clearances. Thousands more had partial access. Identifying a single traitor within this labyrinth was nearly hopeless without a break, or a defector. That break came in December 1988, when Manfred Severin, an East German intelligence officer working under the code name Kana Clay, approached U.S. authorities with a name: James W. Hall III. The CIA dismissed him. German intelligence dismissed him. But U.S. Army counterintelligence did not. Severin's information aligned perfectly with the dates, postings, and patterns of compromise. Once investigators began surveillance on Hall, the truth unraveled rapidly. The wealth, the lifestyle, the unexplained purchases, everything Severin claimed was correct. But suspicion is not evidence. Counterintelligence needed Hall to reveal everything himself. And that is precisely why, on that December evening in Savannah, the FBI staged one of the most flawlessly executed undercover operations of the Cold War, one that would expose a traitor, contain a hemorrhaging intelligence breach, and redefine how America protects secrets. The day after the sting operation, December 21st, 1988, the quiet suburban calm around Fort Stewart, Georgia, shattered under the weight of a coordinated federal action. FBI agents and Army counterintelligence officers surrounded Hall's residence, moving with the precision of a mission rehearsed repeatedly. When Hall answered the door, he displayed none of the dramatic defiance often associated with captured spies. He simply stood there, expression flat, voice low, while the agents placed him under arrest. The man who had walked confidently into a hotel room believing he was meeting the KGB now faced the full force of the U.S. government. Inside the home, investigators found exactly what they expected: classified materials, communication notes, fragments of documents, and crucially, the $30,000 cash payment from the previous night's undercover meeting. Hall offered no explanation, made no attempt to deny what had happened. He simply stated that his lawyer would speak for him. For the FBI, it was a clean, decisive capture. For the U.S. intelligence community, it was the beginning of a painful reckoning. Later that same day, agents in Tampa, Florida, arrested Hüseyin Yildirim, a 60-year-old Turkish-born auto mechanic who had become Hall's courier. Yildirim was not a trained spy, not a hardened intelligence operative. He was a facilitator, a man who connected Hall to his East German handler, known as Der Meister, and transported materials between them. But his role was indispensable. Without a courier, Hall's access meant nothing. Without him, whole chapters of American SIGINT would not have ended up in Stasi vaults. Yildirim faced life imprisonment for conspiracy to commit espionage. With his arrest, the network was fully severed. But the real work had only just begun. Within hours, Army Foreign Counterintelligence Activity Teams initiated a comprehensive damage assessment, a process that would stretch for years and shock even veteran intelligence officers. The scope of betrayal was unlike anything seen since the cases of John Walker or Christopher Boyce. Hall had not just leaked individual documents. He had compromised entire operational frameworks. Project Trojan was the most glaring wound. The system had been painstakingly designed to read the electromagnetic fingerprints of Soviet armor and aircraft, providing NATO commanders with real-time situational awareness. For a decade, it was regarded as a crown jewel of Cold War battlefield readiness. But with Hall's revelations, the Soviets gained an unprecedented advantage. They now understood the system's detection logic. In warfare, whether conventional or electronic, knowledge of your adversary's sensors is a weapon in itself. The result? The U.S. had to spend billions redesigning electronic warfare protocols, reconfiguring detection models, and developing entirely new layers of deception-resistant monitoring. The National SIGINT Requirements List, the 4,258-page master blueprint of U.S. global intelligence priorities, was equally catastrophic. This was not a document meant to be read by foreign adversaries. It was meant to shape American geopolitical awareness for years. With it, the Soviets didn't just learn what the U.S. knew. They learned what the U.S. wanted to know, what it feared it didn't know, and how it intended to close those gaps. Intelligence is not simply a matter of collection. It is a matter of intent, of strategic thought. Hall had exposed those intentions. Even more chilling was the correlation between Hall's betrayals and the death of Major Arthur Nicholson Jr., a U.S. military liaison mission officer. Nicholson's killing in 1985 had nearly triggered an international crisis. At the time, the Soviet Union insisted Nicholson had violated protocol. Yet whispers within the intelligence community argued the Soviets had acted with suspicious precision, almost as if they knew Nicholson's route, tactics, and areas of focus. Years later, as Hall's espionage files were reviewed, those whispers hardened into troubling suspicion. It was now clear Hall had compromised the photographic and reconnaissance procedures that governed USML operations. While historians may never have absolute proof, many intelligence professionals believe Hall's betrayal directly contributed to Nicholson's death. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary part of this saga was how long Hall operated undetected. For 5 years, he lived above his means, purchased vehicles in cash, took private flying lessons, and made multiple trips to Austria, all red flags under modern counterintelligence protocols. But in the 1980s, insider threat detection was not nearly as advanced. Financial disclosures were minimal. Supervisors were not consistently trained to recognize lifestyle anomalies. Investigators often accepted explanations without verification. The intelligence community relied on trust, and Hall exploited that trust with surgical precision. One example stands out. In 1986, during Hall's application for promotion and a warrant officer appointment, an investigator interviewed one of Hall's supervisors. The supervisor casually mentioned that he found it strange Hall owned a new Volvo, an expense even the major himself couldn't justify. But when questioned, Hall delivered a polished lie about a wealthy aunt who had left him a trust fund. The investigator accepted the explanation without verifying a single detail. No financial audit, no estate check, no background confirmation. Paperwork noted the discrepancy, and then the inquiry moved on. Procedurally, the system had all the information needed to flag Hall as a risk, but structurally, it lacked the mechanisms to act. This failure would haunt counterintelligence agencies for decades. The Hall case became a turning point, a moment when the intelligence community realized internal vulnerabilities were not hypothetical. They were active, exploitable, and extraordinarily dangerous. As analysts began piecing together the timeline of Hall's espionage, they discovered he had spent up to 2 hours every workday copying classified documents. Instead of performing his assigned duties, he essentially ran a personal espionage operation inside one of the most secure SIGINT facilities on Earth. And then, in a twist of tragic irony, he often stayed late into the evening to finish his real work, leading supervisors to misinterpret his dedication as loyalty rather than treason. By the time Hall stood before a military judge in 1989, the government had compiled an overwhelming case. His attorney quickly negotiated a plea deal, guilty on 10 espionage charges in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Hall was sentenced to 40 years in prison, fined $50,000, stripped of his military rank, and sent to the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, home to some of the military's most dangerous offenders. For Yildirim, the outcome was even harsher: life imprisonment. But while the individuals responsible were now behind bars, the geopolitical consequences of Hall's betrayal reverberated across NATO. Entire communication security architectures had to be rewritten, encryption systems updated, frequencies changed, operational patterns overhauled. Intelligence officers were forced to assume that anything Hall touched was irreversibly compromised. These changes were not just bureaucratic responses. They reflected the reality that Hall had helped shift the intelligence balance during a critical juncture of the Cold War. His actions had given the Soviet Union a 5-year head start on countering U.S. electronic warfare and intelligence operations. In a geopolitical climate defined by brinkmanship, proxy conflicts, and nuclear posturing, such an edge could have altered the course of a crisis or escalated one. For the intelligence community, Hall's capture was a relief, but the implications of what he had done were just beginning to unfold. When James Hall began serving his sentence in the maximum security confines of the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth, he joined a population of offenders that included murderers, violent criminals, and the rarest class of inmate, traitors whose actions reshaped the strategic landscape of nations. Inside those walls, Hall was not admired. Espionage for money carried none of the ideological weight that sometimes earned spies a grim sort of respect. Hall's betrayal had been purely transactional, a calculated exchange of classified U.S. secrets for cash, vehicles, and lifestyle upgrades. Even among criminals, treason motivated by greed sat at the bottom of the hierarchy. Hall kept to himself, lost in a world where every hour of the day was regimented and monitored, where movement was restricted, and where the reality of his crimes echoed louder than the steel doors that clanged shut behind him. Prison records would later describe him as quiet, compliant, and largely solitary. But behind that silence lay a growing recognition. The world he had sold secrets to no longer existed. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union had collapsed, East Germany had dissolved, and the Stasi, his primary handlers, ceased to exist. The geopolitical structures that once made his espionage valuable had vanished almost overnight. And yet, the consequences of his betrayal remained very much alive. In 2006, author Christy McCrackis interviewed Hall in prison for her book, Seduced by Secrets. It was Hall's first recorded interview, and for the first time, he articulated his motives without the protective veneer of courtrooms or attorneys. He described himself bluntly, a treasonous bastard. No ideology, no dissent, no patriotic disillusionment. He admitted he betrayed his country for one reason only: money. The simplicity of the motive was chilling. It highlighted the most fundamental vulnerability in any classified system: the human being who holds the keys. Hall served 22 years of his 40-year sentence. With good behavior and mandatory reductions, he was released in September 2011 at age 53. The world outside had transformed. Intelligence technology had evolved. Cold War alliances had shifted. And many of the programs he once compromised had been replaced or rebuilt at staggering cost. There were no press conferences, no memoir deals, no public apologies. Hall slipped into obscurity, living under federal supervision, barred from discussing classified material, and forgotten by all but intelligence professionals who studied his case as a warning. But the story didn't end with his release. In a twist buried deep within bureaucratic archives, Germany in 1992 returned more than 13,000 pages of documents Hall had sold to the Stasi. This handover occurred under U.S. pressure, but the decision violated German law because it bypassed the Parliamentary Intelligence Oversight Committee. Officials later claimed they did not recall approving the return, though documentation clearly contradicted those statements. The files, now in NSA custody, served as a haunting inventory of what Hall had destroyed. By that time, the damage had long been absorbed. The U.S. had spent billions redesigning compromised systems. NATO had restructured communication security. Electronic warfare doctrines had been rewritten. Hall's espionage wasn't just a financial cost, it was a strategic reset that demanded years of redevelopment. His betrayal revealed the uncomfortable truth that even the most advanced intelligence networks can crumble if a single insider decides to trade trust for profit. The echoes of his actions reverberated through intelligence training programs across America. Hall's case became a foundational pillar in insider threat education, from NSA security courses to FBI counterintelligence briefings and military intelligence schools. His story was meticulously analyzed, not for its espionage drama, but for the systemic failures it exposed. Financial anomalies became one of the most reliable predictors of insider risk. Before Hall, lifestyle indicators weren't consistently flagged. After Hall, they became standard protocol. Sudden wealth, unexplained purchases, luxury vehicles, unexpected travel. Each became a mandatory point of inquiry. When Hall purchased a Volvo with cash, his supervisor raised an eyebrow, but lacked the investigative framework to act. Today, that same purchase would trigger an automatic review. This shift reflected a broader recognition within the intelligence community. The most dangerous spies are often not ideological zealots, but ordinary individuals who succumb to financial pressure or personal greed. Unlike those driven by ideology, financially motivated spies blend more easily into the workforce. Their motivations are unpredictable, unanchored to belief systems, and capable of causing enormous damage quickly. In the decades after Hall's arrest, numerous spies were caught due to tightened financial monitoring. Some were discovered after purchasing properties well outside their means. Others were flagged after sudden spikes in spending. Hall's legacy, though bitter, helped close vulnerabilities that might have otherwise remained invisible. But one aspect of the damage remains immeasurable: the human cost. Intelligence officials often quantify losses in financial terms, in the number of programs compromised, or in the years of strategic advantage forfeited. But the death of Major Arthur Nicholson Jr. was a human tragedy that no spreadsheet could quantify. Nicholson was a father, a husband, and a decorated officer, conducting lawful reconnaissance under established agreements. His killing shocked the U.S. and strained diplomatic relations with Moscow. Years later, as evidence accumulated, many senior intelligence analysts came to believe Nicholson died because the Soviets had been tipped off, because Hall had sold them the playbook. Hall never mentioned Nicholson in his interview. He never spoke publicly about the human consequences of his betrayal. But within the intelligence community, Nicholson's name is etched into the narrative as the silent casualty of Hall's greed. As the Cold War ended, many of the systems Hall compromised became declassified or obsolete. But for the officers working in those years, the betrayal was personal. Intelligence work thrives on trust. Trust in your team, your systems, your mission. When a traitor emerges from within, that trust fractures in ways that take decades to repair. Hall's story is not a sensational spy thriller. It is a case study in systemic vulnerability, a demonstration of how one individual can manipulate bureaucratic blind spots, exploit institutional trust, and inflict damage that spans continents. It is also a reminder that espionage is rarely cinematic. It's often mundane, subtle, built from quiet theft, carried out repeatedly by someone who blends in until the consequences can no longer be undone. The lesson is stark. Secrecy can be protected by technology, but security is only as strong as the human being guarding it. Hall proved that even the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus can be undone by something as simple, as ancient, and as corrosive as greed. In the years following Hall's release, his name faded from public consciousness, swallowed by the march of new conflicts, new technologies, and new intelligence failures. Yet, inside classified training rooms and counterintelligence briefings, his story grew into something larger than the man himself. He became a benchmark, a case repeatedly invoked to remind analysts, officers, and future intelligence professionals that a single individual operating quietly within the system can inflict damage so vast that it alters strategies, rewrites doctrines, and forces a superpower to rebuild capabilities once thought secure. His betrayal was no longer just history. It was a template of what must never be allowed to happen again. For those who study the behavior of insider threats, Hall's espionage demonstrated an uncomfortable pattern. Most traitors don't begin as ideologues. They don't begin as radicals. They begin as ordinary people under financial pressure, or facing personal dissatisfaction, or tempted by prosperity they believe they deserve but cannot attain. Hall did not view himself as a villain. He viewed himself as underpaid. He convinced himself, as many spies do, that the government would never miss what he took, that the systems he exploited were too vast to be weakened by one person. The truth, however, was the opposite. America's most sensitive SIGINT operations were not weakened. They were fractured, their advantages neutralized, their secrets exposed for adversaries to weaponize. To intelligence historians, the Hall case underscores a recurring reality of the Cold War. The United States, for all its technological superiority, repeatedly found its most damaging weaknesses not in Moscow, East Berlin, or Havana, but within its own ranks. Aldrich Ames, Robert Hanssen, John Walker, Clayton Lonetree, and dozens of others exploited gaps in oversight and the inherent trust placed in cleared personnel. Each case brought reforms, and each reform closed one vulnerability only for another to be discovered later. Hall's betrayal forced the intelligence community to accept that financial monitoring must be relentless, audits uncompromising, and background investigations far more intrusive than what was once considered acceptable. The espionage landscape in which Hall operated was one defined by analog systems, physical documents, and human couriers. Shopping bags filled with classified originals, photocopiers in East German safehouses, coded messages delivered through intermediaries. These methods may seem primitive by today's digital standards, but during the Cold War, they were devastatingly effective. A single photocopied file could expose troop movements, radar frequencies, encryption weaknesses, or intelligence priorities. And Hall didn't deliver one file. He delivered thousands. As modern intelligence evolves into a world of cyber espionage, AI-driven surveillance, and quantum-resistant encryption, Hall's case still resonates. It reminds agencies that the most powerful adversary isn't always a foreign intelligence service. It can be the complacency that settles into a system over time. Financial red flags ignored, background discrepancies accepted, supervisors who hesitate to report unusual behavior because they don't want to seem accusatory. These soft failures, far more than the sophistication of enemy intelligence, paved the way for Hall's success. In the global landscape of the 1980s, when U.S.-Soviet tensions were still defined by nuclear posturing, proxy wars, and technological brinkmanship, Hall's betrayal came at a critical strategic moment. American SIGINT dominance was essential for maintaining NATO's readiness in Europe. Project Trojan, for example, was not merely an intelligence tool. It was a foundation for understanding how quickly Soviet forces could mobilize, where they were deploying, and how prepared NATO forces needed to be. When that system was compromised, so too was the alliance's confidence in its intelligence forecasts. Every radar reading, every intercepted communication, every electronic signal became suspect. The ripple effect extended from West Berlin to Brussels to Washington. One of the most striking ironies is that Hall seemed unaware of the geopolitical implications of the secrets he sold. In his interview, when pressed on why he did it, Hall dismissed ideology entirely. He wasn't pro-Soviet. He wasn't anti-American. He claimed he simply wanted extra money. Yet the consequences of his actions intersected with some of the most volatile moments of the Cold War's final decade. Had tensions escalated further? Had a misinterpreted signal, a misread troop movement, or a misjudged intelligence report triggered military mobilization? The classified data Hall sold could have tipped policymakers into catastrophe. Intelligence is not merely information. It is the lens through which nations interpret threats. Hall clouded that lens at a time when clarity mattered most. Even after the Cold War ended, the footprint of Hall's betrayal continued shaping intelligence doctrine. Agencies began investing heavily in continuous evaluation programs, monitoring financial activity, foreign contacts, and lifestyle inconsistencies, not just during clearance acquisition, but throughout a professional's entire career. Polygraph screenings increased in frequency and complexity. Supervisors received formal training on behavioral indicators of insider threats. The concept of trust but verify became enshrined in intelligence culture. Hall's case was cited in early congressional hearings about insider threat detection following the Ames and Hansen scandals. Later, in the post-9/11 intelligence restructuring, Hall's espionage contributed to the argument that information security must be proactive rather than reactive. And yet, despite the layers of reforms inspired by cases like his, the same vulnerabilities re-emerge from time to time. Human beings, after all, remain the constant variable. No system, no matter how secure, can prevent someone from choosing betrayal if the psychological and financial incentives align. For this reason, instructors teaching counterintelligence still open their lectures with a simple truth, illustrated by Hall's story. The most dangerous threat is the one who already has access. But the Hall case, for all its technical implications, forces us to confront something deeper: the moral cost of espionage. Intelligence failures can be measured in billions of dollars and years of compromised capabilities. What cannot be measured is the fear experienced by soldiers operating in environments where enemy forces may already know their procedures. What cannot be quantified is the grief of families like Major Nicholson's, who lost a husband and father because classified operational methods were sold to a hostile power. Hall never met Major Nicholson. He never saw the ripple effects of the documents he leaked, but history ties them together in a way that can never be undone. In classrooms, training seminars, and intelligence handbooks, Hall's story now serves a solemn purpose. It is not celebrated. It is not dramatized for glamour. It is dissected, as one dissects a failure, so that future analysts understand the stakes of complacency. It reminds officers that loyalty cannot be assumed, that trust must be continuously earned, and that the smallest oversight can become the opening through which catastrophic betrayal flows. If the Cold War taught the world anything, it is that information can be as lethal as weapons, and in the hands of someone willing to sell it, information can destabilize alliances, endanger lives, and reshape global power dynamics. That is the legacy of James W. Hall III. Not the cars he bought, the money he spent, or the lies he told, but the damage he caused, the systems he crippled, and the lives forever altered because he decided his personal comfort outweighed his oath. Hall's life after prison remains obscure. No interviews, no memoirs, no public reckoning. He disappears from the record, a silent figure living quietly somewhere in America. But in intelligence circles, his name remains a warning etched into doctrine. Never ignore the signs. Never assume trust. Never underestimate the cost of a single insider. His betrayal forced the United States to rebuild what had taken decades to create. His actions reshaped counterintelligence policy for a generation. And his story endures not because it is extraordinary, but because it is tragically ordinary. Proof that one individual, given access and opportunity, can alter the trajectory of national security for years.